So, you probably recognise this as a cabbage plant, and it's a member of the Brassica family of plants. It's one of the few things that will grow through the winter months in the UK. But the question I want you to ask yourselves when you look at this is, if you saw this in the supermarket, would you buy it? Second question, I guess, is would you buy it if you happen to have grown it yourself? So it looks a bit different to the cabbages that you see in the supermarket. For a start, it's a lot bigger, and that's because the version that you get in the supermarket has all of these outer leaves trimmed off, so you only get the heart in the middle. The second thing that you probably notice is that a lot of these leaves have got damage to them. They've got a lot of holes in them, caused by caterpillars mostly, and so they're not particularly attractive. You're used to seeing vegetables, I would expect, that are pretty much perfect. So would you buy this? There's nothing actually intrinsically wrong with it in terms of the health of the plant or any problem it's going to cause you. But most of us are conditioned to buying perfect-looking fruit and vegetables. Brassica is a species of plant that has been completely exploited by man and bred in lots of different ways to produce a huge variety of different types of crops. And we're going to take you down some of these now to show you. So we've got a whole bed here, which are all Brassica. Most of them will be Brassica oleracea, so all the same genus and the same species, and yet they look completely different. So we eat lots of different parts of a Brassica plant. Cabbages, as we can see over here, either the ones that we saw earlier that are green cabbages or these ones that are red cabbages, we're eating the leaves. In many cases, such as broccoli and cauliflowers, we're eating the flowers. And if you look, you're familiar with the white cauliflower, but you may not have seen these. So there are some in here that are very green. So you've got a bright, beautiful, bright green flower there of the cauliflower. And then if we move over a little bit more, you can see that we've got this wonderful pink cauliflower, which again has been selected for by man. This is all completely conventional breeding, and yet we've ended up with this enormous diversity of crops. Just down at my feet here you can see that there are round cabbages with very tight heads, so we're eating the leaves again, but rather a different form of leaf to these more open cabbages here. And then if we move down the line a little bit further, you can see that we get to the pointed type of cabbage that you might find in the supermarket. Again, these are relatively free of pest and disease, and so they have been treated with some chemicals. If we move further on, this is a Brassica that's in flower. This was actually originally a broccoli, but the broccoli heads have opened up. So if I take one of these, then it might look more like the kind of broccoli that you're used to. You can just about see that the type of thing that you would normally eat is this bit. But these are the flowers, and so eventually the whole head opens up, and you get this that we can see in front of you, where the whole head is in flower. And these are typical Brassica flowers. If you're not sure whether a plant's a Brassica and it's in flower, then look at the flowers. They all have 4 petals, very distinctly arranged, very simple flower. Absolutely classic of a Brassica. And you'll see a type of Brassica called Brassica napus in flower in the UK in the early part of the summer, and you get fields of yellow, and that's oilseed rape. This is Brassica oleracea, but the oilseed rape is harvested in the UK to provide animal protein and to provide some oils, so you can now buy cold pressed oilseed rape oil in the supermarkets. If we come a bit further down, we can see we've got some broccoli here that's rather later in terms of its flowering, and so here you can see a broccoli head that's rather more like the type of broccoli that you might get, but yet one of the plants in the same row has started to flower, and it opens out like this. And it's very popular with the pollinators down there. You see there's a little honeybee down there, and it's one of the few things around that this honeybee still has left to collect its food from. So one of the consequences of not using very much pesticide is that you get pests. And as much as I'm sure that some of you like eating brassicas such as broccoli, so do pests such as whitefly. And you see if we just touch the plants, then huge amounts of whitefly come off of them. You can control these with chemicals, which is generally done in a commercial setting. But if you let the pest take hold, if you were to try and garden or farm organically, then you are going to lose some yield, because these guys will actually directly eat some of the crop and damage some of the crop so that it isn't there. But it also means that it's not in a saleable condition, and so some of these things you couldn't actually put into a commercial market because they don't meet the quality standards that the supermarkets want. So pests are a real problem, and they effectively cause waste because they mean that there's a portion of the crop that can't be harvested. And so if a farmer is leaving a portion of the crop in his field, that's lost revenue for him, lost profit, and therefore ultimately waste, and typically it'll get ploughed back into the floor. So I'm sure you're familiar with this crop. This quite clearly is an apple tree, and it represents one of the great British crops that's in season now. The apple harvest season runs really from September through to late November, depends a bit on the weather that we're having at the time, and it's possible to get British apples most of the year round now. And you might ask how that is so, because if you pick some of these apples now, then they wouldn't last if you just took them home and put them in your fruit bowl. And the reason that you can get British apples in March and April and so on is because they tend to be harvested and then put into cold storage, usually with high levels of CO2. Now think about why you might want high levels of CO2 and low levels of oxygen if you're trying to keep a fruit in an edible condition for a long time. So these apples, there are lots of different varieties of apples. We're seeing an increasing number of varieties in UK supermarkets now, but there are still lots and lots of different varieties that don't ever make it to the supermarket. Sometimes that's because they don't store very well. Apples have a different biochemistry between different varieties, and some are better adapted to storage than others. It's really important to harvest them when they have just the right amount of sugar in them, so that they're not too far along the line to becoming rotten. However, there are lots of apples that don't make it to the supermarket because they don't make the stringent supermarket standards. They may be too big, too small, or they may have a defect in terms of appearance in some way. Now, sometimes that's because they're misshapen, and sometimes it's because they have evidence of disease on them, but other times it's just because they have a bit of spotting or rust where the apple has been sitting alongside a branch. The other thing that you might notice about this tree, if you look very closely, is that it looks like it's two trees, which in fact it is. If you look at the base of the tree, you can see a very swollen area. Now, the apples in this country and around the world are grown on different rootstocks. So this is the root of one type of apple, and then the fruiting part of the apple has been joined to it by a process known as grafting. And the great curiosity is, and we really still don't know how this works at a genetic level, is that the rootstock determines the height of the plant. So there are lots of different rootstocks. If you have a rootstock called M9, then you will get a very short plant. If you have a rootstock called M13, then you'll get a slightly taller plant. I don't know actually which rootstock this is. My guess is it's probably M9, since this is pretty short. And clearly the advantage is that the fruit are very easy to pick. If you were to grow these apples on their own rootstock, then the chances are it will be a very tall tree and that harvesting would be extremely difficult. So the process of grafting and the understanding of which rootstocks confer plants of the right height has been a really important step forward in terms of apple breeding and making the crop much more commercial. This is an apple I've just picked from this tree. Very nice looking apple. I'd be quite happy to eat this apple. Would you ever find it in the supermarket? No. Partly because it's misshapen, and partly because it has some of these spots on it that you can see. These aren't going to do you any harm. There's no reason why you shouldn't eat this fruit. The other thing it has, if you can see, is a very small rub here, next to where the flower was. And that's where the apple has just touched a branch. And again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this apple. So ask yourself, would you buy it from a supermarket? Would you buy it if you'd grown it yourself? Would you actually eat it if it was free? And then ask various questions about why apples like this don't find their way onto our shelves, why a perfectly good quality crop isn't being made available for human consumption, and is instead either going into processing or into landfill or just this variety isn't being used commercially, when there's actually nothing wrong with it in terms of its nutrition.